Now, at a little after 12:15, it's time for this week's music feature, When Opera Comes to Town. Susan Rutherford takes us away from the glitter and glamour of London and uncovers stories from the rich history of provincial opera.
One October morning in 1836, thousands of people stood in the rain to watch a funeral cortege pass by. It was bearing the body of the most famous opera singer in the world, Maria Malibran. At the age of only 28, her brief but blazing career had suddenly come to an end.
Malibran was absolutely huge a star. I mean, of all the performers that I think I've found references to in the 19th century, I don't think anyone would rank with Malibran. I found a reference to somebody born in 1843 who was christened Maria Malibran, whatever the name was. And the impact that she must have had on the public at large was impossible for us to understand these days, I think.
But Malibran's last moments occurred not in London or Paris or Milan, but Manchester. It was the second time she'd sung there. The first was 11 years ago, at the beginning of her career. Her return visit, now in the full glory of her stardom, was something of a coup for Manchester's festival committee, who paid her the considerable fee of 600 guineas. And it all began so well. Malibran had arrived looking pale and tired, but over 3 days she nonetheless sang a number of concerts to rapt audiences. On the 16th of September, she performed a duet with Maria Caradori-Allen, in which the two singers vied with each other in exhilarating fashion. Quanto è barbaro il mio fatto, from Mercadante's opera Andronico, sung by Jennifer Larmore and Magella Cullach. Shortly after this tour de force, Malibran collapsed. 10 days later, she died. And then, what was undeniably a tragedy became increasingly more like a farce. Both her husband and her doctor left Manchester less than 2 hours after her last breath, leaving behind her still warm body. The festival committee did the only possible thing under the circumstances. They called a meeting. After much debate, they decided that she should be buried with all the pomp and ceremony due to the most famous opera singer in the world, and a lavish funeral was duly arranged. But the night before it took place, the festival committee received word that Malibran's husband now wanted her to be buried in Brussels. Another meeting was hastily convened. It was decided that things had gone much too far and at too great a cost to be cancelled. And Malibran was laid to rest in the grounds of what is now Manchester Cathedral. She might still be there now, but following a heartfelt plea by her mother, the body was quietly exhumed one dawn and sent on its way. Touring was a lucrative but hazardous business. Emma Zilli died of yellow fever in Latin America in 1901. Lilian Nordica succumbed to pneumonia following a shipwreck in 1914. But these intrepid singers of earlier times brought opera to many corners of the world, including Britain. The historian John Ward is also a member of the Carl Rosa Opera Trust.
You did have provincial opera performances, I think, in the late 18th century, but they really couldn't amount to very much because the problem is transportation. If you're going to transport an opera company, you're talking in the region of about 40, 50 people at least. Well, you would have to travel by stagecoach, and that could be hazardous. I mean, there are instances of one or two troops getting lost and that kind of thing. You'd have opera in the West End of London, and you'd get people who'd want to put on opera in the provinces. In some places, it would be just simply concerts, but in others, where the local theatre could do what they had to do in the way of chorus and supporting artists and so on, it would be opera.
And the visits by big stars, the concert party type
Yes.
things played a role in developing a particular town's aspirations to culture as well,
yes, most
didn't
definitely.
it?
It was. Oh yes, it was.
Yeah.
That was a big thing. I mean, Melba came to Bacup in the early 1900s. It was that Bacup's one of the northern cotton towns. And oh yes, when she came to Bacup, you know, oh God, this was a sort of like almost like a seal of approval by royalty. To have a Melba concert was something.
Yeah. Civic pride, isn't
Oh
it?
yes, undoubtedly, yes. It means you had arrived. You know, yeah, you were culture conscious. Yes.
But star singers were only one and a relatively small aspect of the touring circuit. Opera, in one form or another, had begun to travel beyond the theatres into all corners of society. It was sung in the music halls and pantomimes, glee clubs and domestic drawing rooms, played by brass bands in the parks and barrel organs on the streets. And as musicologist Alexandra Wilson points out, from the middle of the 19th century there was an extraordinary growth in the numbers of travelling opera troupes of all shapes and sizes.
There were dozens and dozens of touring operatic companies, of which the Carl Rosa Company and the Moody Manners Company were the most famous. And these companies would go to cities and smaller towns, indeed, all over the country, particularly the industrial north of England. And they would set up residence in these towns, a week-long residence, say, and they'd come back several times a year, or several different companies would visit in a year. So really, people living in these towns and cities had really quite considerable exposure to opera. Much more, I'd say, than audiences later in the 20th century were able to benefit from.
The Carl Rosa Opera Company was the largest and most financially successful of these troupes. Its tours in Britain and Ireland even found their way into literature, courtesy of James Joyce and D.H. Lawrence. In Lawrence's The White Peacock, George and Meg celebrate their hasty marriage by going to see Carl Rosa's production of Carmen in Nottingham. The opera gave them a tantalising glimpse of other ways of living. They stared on the stage, fascinated. The music rose like a storm and swept and rattled at their feet. When it was all over, they rose bewildered, stunned, she with tears in her eyes, he with a strange, wild beating of his heart. Stephen Martin has researched the beginnings of the company.
The Carl Rosa Company started in March 1866, or the beginnings of it date then, to a concert at Crystal Palace when Carl Rosa met the soprano Euphrosyne Parepa, who was born in Edinburgh despite her name. They got together and they toured America and were a great success until Euphrosyne fell pregnant and became ill. They returned to England and decided to start up a company in England, an English opera company that specialised in grand opera, the sort of serious side of opera. And he saw that opera in English, there was a market for it in the provinces particularly.
The initial repertoire that they did in Britain was simply the repertoire they'd given in America. But then it expanded. Obviously, Balfe was featured prominently, and the Bohemian Girl for that period, for the Rosa years, especially in the early part, from about the 1870s to about the mid-1880s, the Bohemian Girl was the one that was most frequently performed.
The Bohemian Girl was a ballad opera composed by the Irish singer Michael Balfe in 1843. The 100 performances it received in its first production in London were just the beginning of its success both in Britain and Ireland and further afield. One item alone, the tenor's ballad When Other Lips and Other Hearts, sold over 80,000 copies within the first year. When Other Lips and Other Hearts from the Bohemian Girl, sung by the great Irish tenor John McCormack in that recording from 1916. The touring companies were self-financing and wholly dependent on their box office income. Not surprisingly, the choice of repertoire was crucial when financial success depended on attracting a popular audience.
These companies must have played to quite a diverse audience. You know, they'd play to the mill owners at one end of the spectrum and the mill workers at the other, because they couldn't possibly have sold out these theatres night after night if they'd only been, attracting the really well-to-do members of the audience. So all sorts of different people got to hear opera. I think far more so at this turn of the 19th, 20th century than later on. So you could really say that opera was far more democratic back then and really seen far more as entertainment than art. I mean, it certainly wasn't lowbrow, but then it certainly wasn't highbrow either. And the many members of the respectable middle classes in the 19th century who were very into self-education, self-improvement, really didn't think much of opera at all. For them, they sort of created an identity for themselves, a cultural identity for themselves by going to serious classical concerts. Opera was something that was more frivolous, something they associated with the aristocracy, who they saw as frivolous, and something that was sort of foreign, perhaps even not quite respectable.
Perhaps the lack of respectability was what made the sensation of opera so appealing. Here's Andrew Lamb.
The audiences there would go to the theatres. They'd go for the big tunes, of course. The audience in the pit would love the big tunes. They'd love the high notes that the singers would add. They loved the take-home arias that they could perform in their drawing rooms afterwards. And not least in Balfe's operas, they loved the "With One Bound Our Heroine Was Free" finales. Balfe composed an opera called Joan of Arc, in which Joan escapes from the stake at the last minute.
Rosa related to his public in the sense that he gave them what they wanted. He didn't give them what he thought they ought to want. And he would use the popular stuff like Bohemian Girl. He knew he'd get good houses, and that would be a banker for him. And he'd also throw in some operas which were perhaps new. In fact, so much he had commissioned. It was meeting the demand of, if you like, the musical establishment who wanted the native musicians being encouraged and so on. And he did that. In effect, he balanced it out. He put on popular operas, and he would introduce sort of English versions of new operas from the continent. So he was actually doing his best to please everyone. And financially, he balanced it out so that he certainly didn't lose any money on it.
On the contrary, Carl Rosa's fortune on his death in 1889 was £130,000, the equivalent today of around £10 million. By 1900, the Carl Rosa had produced almost 30 foreign operas in translation, including Wagner's The Flying Dutchman, Rienzi and Tristan and Isolde, Verdi's Aida, Otello and The Force of Destiny, and the pairing of Mascagni's Cavalleria Rusticana and Leoncavallo's Pagliacci. But the company also brought in works that were entirely new to Britain: Massenet's Manon, Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel, and an opera that would become one of the most famous of all, Puccini's La Bohème.
Your tiny hand is frozen. Let me warm it into life. Our search is useless. In darkness all is hidden.
In 1897, the company staged the first British performances, although in English translation, of La Bohème at the Theatre Royal, Manchester.
But very soon the moon will be shining, and in the moonlight our search will continue.
There are a few different theories about why it was first performed outside London. He wasn't particularly well known in Britain at that time, so Manon Lescaut had been performed at Covent Garden but hadn't been a great success. Some say that Covent Garden turned down La Bohème. Others say that Ricordi bypassed Covent Garden, didn't even try to get it staged there, and approached this touring company, the Carl Rosa Company, instead. When they were supervising the rehearsals, I think they weren't particularly impressed by the company's standards of performance, and both of them seemed to have feared as the rehearsals went on that this was going to be an absolutely terrible fiasco. Now, in fact, that wasn't the case, and apparently on the journey home, Puccini was absolutely delighted and was full of enthusiasm for this first performance, and particularly for the audience who had greeted his work so warmly. But that said, he hadn't liked Manchester very much, it must be said. He made all sorts of comments about how it was full of black smoke, darkness, cold, rain, cotton factories, although he said, woe betide anybody who doesn't wear wool because it's so cold. It's foggy, a horrible place to stay, he said, and full of dogs, noisy dogs.
Your roguish eyes have robbed me of all my dreams, bereft me. Dreams of age so fleeting, fancies that are no more, and yet I don't regret Now you know my story. Pray tell me yours. Won't you tell me May I not know?
Travelling, as Puccini's grumbles demonstrate, brought all the problems of different environments and the loss of home comforts. But other artists had happier experiences. The violinist Sarah Crouch remembers the camaraderie of her time in the Carl Rosa Orchestra during the 1950s, when the company travelled in its own train.
It wasn't as big as a big opera orchestra nowadays, which would be in Covent Garden, say, or E&O. I remember there were 8 first violins and 6 seconds, and therefore about 4 cellos, 3 it was that sort of string section. And we used to go from venue to venue by steam train, puffer train, and the bigger places like Manchester or Liverpool or other places, we were there perhaps for a fortnight, but other places just a week. So we'd go from A to B all over the country, and it wasn't going to the nearest venue next. I mean, it was like going from, say, Brighton up to Newcastle and then down to Torquay. It was just like that.
What types of accommodation did they provide for you?
Well, they didn't. When arrived at a town, you had to go to the district where they had the boarding houses and, as we called it, go on the knocker and find places to stay. I do remember 1 or 2 dicey ones, when of course we couldn't afford to stay in hotels. So it was always guest houses, boarding houses.
And you talked about you joined the company directly after leaving music college in London.
Yes, I was lucky. And most of the orchestra were young. And for some people it was their first jobs, like for me. And so we had a lot to learn. And it was very good experience playing in an opera orchestra.
In what way?
It helped me to listen to what was going on so I could fit in, and it was great. But also another wonderful thing was, one of the operas we did was Tannhäuser. But with 8 first violins and 6 seconds, a smallish string orchestra, one had to play really very strongly and, it was amazing.
The sense of being with a close-knit company was what made the frequent changes of venue tolerable, even pleasurable, for some of the artists. Back in the 19th century, the company were on the road, as George Bernard Shaw said, practically all year round. It was a life that echoed the fictional gypsies they played on stage in so many operas, The Bohemian Girl, Il Trovatore, Carmen. A life of movement, with temporary residencies of usually no more than a week, but sometimes even less.
It could be that the smaller venues could afford Rosa for 2 nights, but they couldn't afford the Rosa Company for a whole week. He did, I think, 2 nights once in Accrington in the 1880s, and that's not the place you'd think you'd have the Carl Rosa. Probably the most unusual performance that he ever did, Burton-on-Trent. There was no actual theatre, I think, so he was invited there by Bess's Brewery. They had a stage built in the brewing hall or something on huge barrels with planks on top. And I think they did Carmen there. 2 nights. It's the kind of thing that's hard to imagine, but it was done, and everybody thought it was great.
Carmen became an industry in itself. In 1891, the Carl Rosa even developed a separate troupe, the Carmen Company, to cater for the demand. But the initial touring rights were acquired 11 years earlier, not by Carl Rosa, but by a female impresario, Emily Soldine. She was just one of a number of women singers of the day who found that the touring companies offered opportunities for management as well as performance. Her choice of Carmen, though, was a daring one. The opera's portrayal of its sensual, rebellious heroine was criticised so severely at its Parisian premiere in 1875 that the bad notices were blamed as the cause of Bizet's death, and the opera wasn't revived again at the Opéra Comique until 1883. But it was a role that attracted a wide range of women singers, sopranos and mezzos alike, perhaps because, in some ways, they felt they were playing themselves. A review of Soldine just over a year earlier said, "Her voice is all music. No singer has ever wielded an influence so great, a power so electric, or extracted an applause so ecstatic and spontaneous." Andrew Lamb has been researching Soldine's life.
Somehow, for some reason, Emily stepped in and managed to acquire the touring rights for the English version, and they made a great success of this, touring England. She started off in Leicester, and then they went on to the Theatre Royal Birmingham, Princess Theatre Manchester, a couple of weeks, I think, just performing just Carmen in those places. Some of the other places, other works were added, but they went on to Sheffield, Hull, Leeds, Liverpool, then across the Irish Sea to Dublin and Belfast. And by that time it was August, so then they went to the seaside, because it was seaside entertainment as well. And there were 3 nights at the Winter Garden Southport and another week at the Prince of Wales Theatre Blackpool. And by that time, we got to the end of August, and they went on up to Edinburgh, Newcastle, Glasgow, back down to Bradford, Brighton and Portsmouth.
By her own account, Soldine's pioneering tour was highly successful. The audience stood in the streets for hours before the doors opened at the first performances. In Dublin, there was great excitement, whilst in Liverpool, Soldine and her co-star sang the opera every night for 3 consecutive weeks to crammed houses. But she also tells us that the opera was very difficult to produce. It was extremely exhausting for the principal singers, and there was no end of bother with the orchestra. Fancy, 3 trombones all wanted 6 shillings per week each.
There was a conductor, so Emily would have her principal, she would have her chorus, she would have her musical director, but the orchestra would be picked up locally. There's a rather lovely little story. It was actually when she got over to Dublin, and the flute player, who must have been a local musician, had written the following lyric: "Soldine's collaring all the chips, Bizet's gone to heaven, and I sit here a-playing the flute for a paltry 3 and 11. I assume he was a local player who was engaged at that theatre rather than a member of Soldine's company.
From far away mysterious sounds, like bells that echo ever sweeter, would seem strangely faint to greet the gypsy girl from distant lands. And tambourines would join the game, with passionate guitars unleashing the rhythm's distant but unceasing. Ever they song, ever they sing, ever they song, ever they sing.
The Gypsy Dance from Carmen. Most, if not all, the touring companies supplemented both chorus and orchestra with local musicians, usually professionals or semi-professionals, but quite often amateur musicians too. The Carl Rosa Opera Company had a core orchestra of strings, woodwind and brass soloists, and then recruited extra players in the towns. Here's Stephen Martin.
There was always a great tradition of involving local people in travelling opera productions, because it was simply impractical to, rely on taking a whole chorus with you everywhere you went. And some church choirs were involved, or choral societies grew up as a result of the opera company's visits, and it really built up a good relationship between the travelling opera companies and the local people who looked forward to taking part in the opera company productions. They inspired people to get involved with opera, and you see a lot of amateur opera societies coming to being in the 19th century. And I think opera really was something that people got involved with.
When opera came to town then, it was no longer merely an exotic outsider, but something that united both community and artists in music making. By 1900, the travelling troupes were at their height. They were, for the most part, commercially successful, they attracted large and diverse audiences, they commissioned new works or made foreign ones more accessible through English translation, and they even made opera a shared enterprise with the communities they visited and promoted the development of local talent. They had, in the words of the Manchester critic Neville Cardus, made opera a popular entertainment for the masses. But it was all too brief a flowering. As the new century unfolded, the number of touring companies contracted. The Carl Rosa survived, with a much reduced repertory, until 1960. Most of the other touring companies had gradually disappeared long before. The reasons behind their decline were complex and varied. New technologies, new entertainments, new lifestyles. But their legacies remain. They formed the roots of the regional opera companies today, all of which, including a new revived Carl Rosa Company, continue to tour and to engage with their communities through outreach and education work. The idea of opera in English became enshrined in the policies of the English National Opera Company in London, and the travelling troupes were an invaluable training ground for opera practitioners of all kinds, conductors, instrumentalists, directors, managers, and, of course, singers. The dramatic soprano Eva Turner, perhaps Britain's most famous opera singer during the interwar years, was inspired to become a singer after seeing a performance by the Carl Rosa troupe in Bristol, and then began her career with them.
I was utterly dismayed, I remember, after having been a student for a course of 3 years or more at the Royal Academy of Music, only to be offered a contract as a chorister. But today I've appreciated it beyond measure. Throughout my life I have, because it really contributed to giving me a freedom of movement and so on, and a knowledge of the stage, because in the Carl Rosa one was somewhat thrown on one's own resources. There was not always the money available for the necessary rehearsals and so on. My first part was the First Lady in the Magic Flute. And for that I had the princely sum of 5 shillings, extra to my chorus wages, of course. Well, then, of course, we went on tour. And you must remember this was after the First World War had begun. There were often great difficulties with transport. At times, I remember from the Old King's Theatre in Hammersmith, we all travelled in a lorry to the Midlands somewhere. These were growing pains, and I've always welcomed them, because if you can adjust or adapt yourself to prevailing conditions, you already are on the way, I think, very much. They were wonderful days, really. Eventually, I came to bigger and bigger parts, and it really was for me. I adored it. I adored it. I think I would have sung without earning any money.
Dame Eva Turner. I asked Martin Pickard, head of music at Opera North, how current practices compare with the old touring companies.
We're probably spending 9 months or so of the year in Leeds because we rehearse everything here, and of course that's the most time-consuming thing. And then we spend 3 weeks spread across the year in each of our main touring centres, which are Manchester, Newcastle and Nottingham. And on top of that, we will sometimes find ourselves in other theatres.
What determines your choice of venue then?
It's largely down to discussions with the Arts Council, actually, because the Arts Council now has a large say in where the touring companies go, because touring is a costly exercise. The support for it tends inevitably, the bulk of it tends to come from the Arts Council and from the state, and they then strategically see where they want the touring to go and divide it up among the touring companies.
Carl Rosa and a number of other companies managed to tour without any public subsidy at all, and they made a profit. Is that possible now, or was that dependent on audiences having lower expectations in terms of set design, costumes, things that are really quite expensive?
I think it's probably a combination of things. I suspect that labour costs were generally lower in those days. I mean, what makes opera expensive is that it is a very labour-intensive operation. If you go to an opera performance, there are a huge number of people being employed simply in that performance, to say nothing of the people who are sitting in the office organising the payslips or whatever. And I suspect that things were technically more simple. Yes, it would be quite interesting to see what the artistic standards were, what the musical standards were.
The other thing that they did, apparently only half the orchestra was, if you like, part of the company. The other half of the orchestra was hired locally. This was a feature with the chorus as well, that some, if not most of the chorus again, would be hired locally. This to me gives a wonderful image of the opera being made within the community.
Yes, we have done that, not with our main stage shows, but a couple of years ago I was involved in a small touring production of Hansel and Gretel, of the Humperdinck Hansel and Gretel. And as you know, at the end of Hansel and Gretel there's a children's chorus, and we recruited the children's chorus in each town that we went to, and they rehearsed in advance, and then they came and were part of our show alongside the professional singers and the professional instrumentalists. That was a wonderful experience, because you really felt it was a great experience for them, it was a great experience for us, it was a great experience for their mums and dads and friends who came and saw them in it. That is much more tricky in a main stage show. The kind of very intricate opera production that we do actually militates against that kind of thing. I mean, if you look at La Bohème, which we've currently been doing, the second act of La Bohème, you're in Café Momus. We have a chorus of 36 or so on stage, doing things that are technically quite complicated. There's a huge bench in the middle of the stage on casters that needs to be moved around at very precise moments, but also on an artistic level, I think they are working very individually. The idea that you could then recruit somebody at the beginning of the week on Monday and put them in La Bohème on Tuesday night is actually unthinkable in the kind of production that audiences have come to expect nowadays.
It almost sounds, from what you're describing, as if there are the big tours you do each year, but the outreach work, in effect, is a type of mini-touring that opera, if you like, goes out into the community in various forms and engages with the community.
I think that's so. Actually, there's a lot that is going on, bubbling along kind of slightly under the public radar, in particular institutions and particular communities round about the place. And I suspect the philosophy behind it, you know the history better than I do, is partly almost a decision to try and replace what was lost, that relationship between the old touring companies and the local community, that was something very valuable, and that in modern day terms we should try and replicate that. if we are to keep this art form alive, I think we have to think quite laterally and see ourselves as something bigger than just the 1,500 people who come and see us in the theatre. I think everyone who works in this business has a certain proselytizing side to them, that we don't just want to play opera to the usual suspects. We actually want to get out there and show it to everyone who might be interested in it, because they won't all love it in the end. But I think we have enough confidence in it as an art form to think that some of them seriously will.
Opera brought musicians into the community. It took others away. Wallace Hartley was a young bank clerk from Combe, a small town just north of Manchester. But he was also a keen amateur violinist, and music offered new life. The Carl Rosa Company provided his first major professional opportunity. Then he moved from touring opera to cruise ships, the Lusitania, the Mauretania. And then in 1912, newly engaged to be married, he acquired the post of the band leader on a prestigious cruise liner on her maiden voyage bound for New York. The night the ship hit the iceberg, because this was, of course, the Titanic, Hartley and his band played on deck as the passengers were mustered for the lifeboats. And it was this image of music's accompaniment to the very end of life that captured the public imagination, that seemed to convey most poignantly the anguish of those final moments. To a society sensitized to music's capacity to communicate feeling, Hartley and his band became the means by which the tragedy of the Titanic could somehow be heard, comprehended. Days later, Hartley's body was pulled out of the water, his violin still strapped to his chest, and he was brought home. The onlookers at Malibran's funeral 76 years earlier had come to witness, from curiosity or sentiment, the passing of a magical, exotic stranger. The 30,000 people lining the streets at Hartley's funeral in Combe, equally curious and sentimental, were paying tribute to one of their own, someone whom music had also made, though in a different way to Malibran, into a kind of legend.
One of the pieces played by Wallace Hartley and his fellow musicians on the Titanic, the Barcarolle, from Offenbach's opera The Tales of Hoffmann, performed there by the Titanic Band. When the Opera Comes to Town was presented by Susan Rutherford and produced in Cardiff by Kerry Clark.